Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast, brought to you by PenFed. I'm your host, Heather Lucky Penney. Here on the Aerospace Advantage, we speak with leaders in the DoD, industry, and other subject matter experts to explore the intersection of strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. We're living in an incredibly dynamic air power age. Nowhere is this more true than when it comes to small drones. Whether looking at combat trends in places like Ukraine or the Red Sea, it's obvious that these new tools are changing the scale and scope of air power. They effectively provide individual actors at the most tactical levels of the fight to access micro reconnaissance strike complexes that are precise and lethal. We've seen the results. Tanks and fixed fortifications under siege, and the most advanced warships under attack by systems that more closely represent what you'd find at a hobby shop than in an advanced combat arsenal. Now, some claim that this represents a new era of air power that should hasten the end of traditional approaches for offensive and defensive air superiority. Others suggest that this is more of a broadening of the threat, involving new technologies, but not invalidating proven concepts of operation. And that's what we're here to discuss today. How should we think about these new small drones, and what do they mean for the air superiority mission? Should we scrap all of our top-end fighters, or should we just broaden how we approach the mission? And just a note for our listeners, the views and comments from the Air Force active duty officers here on the Aerospace Advantage are their own and do not represent or reflect the views of the U.S. Air Force or the Department of Defense. So joining me today to discuss this is our very own Lieutenant General Dave Deptula, a highly experienced fighter pilot and air commander. Sir, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Heather. I look forward to the discussion.
And we also have our Air Force fellow, Lieutenant Colonel Grant SWAT Georgulis. SWAT is a seasoned air battle manager. SWAT, great to have you here.
Hey, thanks, Luckily. Looking forward to the discussion today.
So when it comes to the air superiority conversation, these are some of the most experienced individuals you can find with that kind of wisdom, perspective, and judgment that really matters. And they just got back from a conference at Air University where they presented on this topic. And we wanted to make sure that you were able to hear their perspectives too. So to start with, General Deptula, I tried to lay out sort of the broad spectrum of trends that we're seeing these days. But as an air commander, you have a unique perspective of the application of air power, first from Desert Storm, and then through the initial combat operations of Enduring Freedom. Could you please paint a picture for how you've seen the air combat picture evolve in recent years, especially when it comes to small drones?
Yeah, sure, Heather. Small UAVs, if you will, have changed the character of some elements of warfare. That's undeniable. But we must understand these developments and react to them, as you mentioned in your introduction, as both challenges and opportunities. However, what I think is really important is those determinations have to be grounded in a balanced way and informed by realistic perspective. Unfortunately, too much of the current discourse that we see printed in some of the publications out there is aimed to cause a splash, and it confuses tactical innovations like the widespread use of small UAVs in some tactical applications with actual changes to the operational nature of warfare, which stay immutable. The actual effects of small UAVs, commonly called drones, and I'll talk about that term here later on, are many. I mean, there are lots of them. But perhaps most significant in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war is that they provide individual soldiers access and control of precision-guided munitions. That's what they really are. And when you think about it, before this war, PGMs were generally only applied in quantity by combat aircraft. But as that old saying goes, necessity is the mother of invention. And without the military capacity or capabilities of NATO, Ukraine had to come up with a means to effectively defend themselves, considering their weapon capacity deficiencies relative to Russia. And their solution was to develop cheap, easy to produce, and tactically effective precision-guided munitions, which frankly are largely quadcopters with explosive charges tied to them, that could be effectively used in both traditional infantry and armor engagements. Now, some people will say, well, wait a second, there are other uses of UAVs. Well, yeah, there's a second class convolutedly termed sometimes, or most of the time, one-way kamikaze lethal attack drones with many other adjectives attached to them. But in fact, they're simply cruise missiles. They're used as substitute for penetrating aircraft delivering PGMs. These low-cost substitutes are being used by Ukraine to conduct traditional strategic attack and interdiction missions into Russia, but not at the rate or the intensity possible with a robust coalition of air forces, as we saw in Desert Storm, or what's available with NATO. And so let me just give you the facts. In 2021, the Ukrainians were not producing any small UAVs carrying explosives or long-range cruise missiles. Last year, they produced over 1 million annually, and they're on track to greatly increase that number in the future. The numbers I'm hearing for this year are over 2.5 million. So these developments, I would tell you, reflect Ukraine's brilliant ingenuity under duress. And in fact, person-portable PGMs, which I think is a term more accurately describing these munitions, and make no doubt about it, that's what they are having great impact. So much so that their effective use forecasts the looming decline in the relevance of the traditional use of infantry and armor. And most certainly, they're inhibiting mobility in ground combat. Now, that foretells a real revolution in warfare based on reality, not some supposed need to move beyond air superiority with invented notions of air denial that are already inherent in the condition of air superiority. And what strikes me is that contributing to some of these curious thoughts that we're hearing is that the term drone is now so ubiquitous that it has become an imprecise descriptor today, encompassing a wide range of UAVs and munitions with varying capabilities and applications. You kind of mentioned a little bit of this in your introduction, but this ambiguity obscures the distinctions between small hobbyist drones, military aircraft, cruise missiles, and munitions. And that leads to misunderstandings and inaccurate perceptions. And that's what we're hearing. And there's no better example than the mistaken assertion that the so-called drone attack on Tower 22 in January of 2024, that unfortunately killed 3 U.S. soldiers, was the first time in nearly 70 years that the U.S. military lost ground combatants to an adversary airstrike, excluding missile attacks. Here's the deal. The reality is that the weapons used in that attack were in fact cruise missiles. They were munitions, not reusable strike aircraft. Furthermore, no aircraft or ground-based air defenses, for that matter, were tasked with protecting that outpost. That was the failure. It was not one of a deficiency in air superiority. So let me stop there, but that gives you some background into what's going on here. These are incredibly changing the character of warfare munitions, but in only some localized situations, and they do have to be dealt with both from an offensive and a defensive perspective.
And we need to also understand the limitations that they have, right? I mean, it does provide an individual soldier on the ground their own precision reconnaissance strike complex, right? I mean, they can see what they're going after. They can look over the next hill. They can look around the corner, and they can deliver some very small level of explosives. But it's not going to give you the mass, the concentration, the intensity, or even the kinetic power you need to be able to truly collapse an adversary's ability to wage war. So it just devolves into sort of this attrition type of warfare. And it's fundamentally, I think, right now, the way we're seeing it evolve is more defensive rather than offensive. It's a lot like IEDs. So
no, that is a pretty good description. And remember, I go back to what I'd mentioned earlier in the context of Ukraine had to come up with something. They're not going to defeat a nation that is 3-4 times their size using the same tactics that Russia was using against them. That's the whole reason why we've ended up in this flashback to World War I trench warfare.
Oh, I know.
They came up with this alternative, and that's to use these small drones as individually controlled PGMs.
And it was smart, right? I mean, they made that kind of innovation in the field out of necessity and desperation. But we also have to remember, let's not learn the wrong lessons from Ukraine-Russian war. Let's make sure we're learning the right lessons. And people overlook that fundamentally what Russia and Ukraine were post-Soviet armies operating off of post-Soviet doctrine and the way that they employ their air power. So they weren't employing air power in the Western way, and the way that we know enables and empowers a force to win through the application of air superiority and strategic strike, denying that adversary sanctuary and collapsing their ability to wage war.
And that's why they're seeking modern Western aircraft right now in the pursuit of additional F-16s and Mirage 2000s. But it's not like they're ignoring those capabilities. They're seeking those capabilities out.
Yeah, no, exactly. And just because Russia has advanced air defenses, surface-to-air missiles, S-300s, S-400s, doesn't mean that traditional Western air power is now irrelevant. It just means, yeah, it's gotten harder. We've got more threats that we need to face. But
again, I hate to drag this out, but we have an hour or so. I'll just comment that, no, that's spot on. And oh, by the way, if you want to see what is required to deal with those kind of threats in a conclusive way, we just witnessed the use of U.S.-produced F-35s by Israel, flying 1,000 miles, penetrating into the heart of Iranian airspace, not just avoiding, but eliminating those advanced Russian-built surface-to-air missile systems, attacking a whole variety of other desired targets, and coming home completely safe. By the way, there were no drones involved in that attack. There are no drones that are able to do that today, nor will there be for the foreseeable future.
Amen. So we've talked about what's driven our adversaries to pursue these small drones, right? These hobby shops, if you will. But are we seeing our other adversaries universally go in this direction, or is it more of like an additive dimension? I believe the fundamental tools of air power still remain, and the enduring principles of air power application still remain relevant and will be even more so into the future.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I agree. I mean, look, part of the infatuation with drones is they do provide some significant capabilities to players who otherwise couldn't afford the capabilities resident in the larger air forces that exist. But at the same time, remember, these are tools. Okay, I like to tell people there's no such thing as drone warfare. There's warfare.
Yeah.
All right. And these drones are elements of them that may or may not be used depending upon the context of the particular combat situation. What was the world over the last 2 weeks extraordinarily concerned with? Potential conflict between India and Pakistan. And that conflict did erupt. And what was used? Traditional air power. I just watched a Pakistani senior official debrief what was a very significant air battle between the opposing air forces, during which there were no small drones used. So we have to be careful in not hopping onto the latest shiny marble if it is the definitive solution in the conduct of warfare. They're tools, they have their place, and they are a cheap means to accomplish missions like intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, precision attack. And I would tell you, though, that they've largely been a response to conditions that prevented nations, in the case of Ukraine and Russia, from achieving air superiority. They are forced to alternatives. Yeah. So there's a couple of perspectives there. Now, all of that said doesn't mean that, and this is one of my concerns, is that the small UAVs have introduced some significant capabilities that we as a nation are going to have to deal with, even though we have a pretty robust military, although it's been declining in size, unfortunately, for the last 3 decades. We're going to have to deal with these, mainly from a defensive perspective, but we're also capitalizing on not necessarily the small UAVs, but those too have their place in our military. But we're embracing artificial intelligence and autonomy in the form of collaborative combat aircraft, which we've talked about before. And so we're introducing the uninhabited nature of using vehicles in the conduct of warfare to a greater and greater degree than we ever have before. But the fundamental tenets and principles of air power still apply.
This is true. I mean, if drones were decisive, we would have seen the conflict in Ukraine come to a screeching halt and resolution had they been decisive factors, but they haven't been. They've just been blunting capabilities that have increased the effectiveness and lethality for the individual soldier on the ground, but it hasn't been something that's been able to decisively bring an end to that conflict. So, Swat, you've been quiet here because we haven't really been talking much with you, but I want to bring you on. As an air battle manager for our team, help us understand the airspace paradigm that's involved with these small drones. How does that overlay with what we normally see with traditional air operations?
Yeah, absolutely, Heather. I think that the biggest takeaway of what I'm about to tell you is that we cannot react to the alarmism that we're seeing put out in various forms of articles and scholarship, and that there is air-powered doctrine, specifically airspace management procedures that are codified that can be used and can be adapted to account for what we're seeing with the overwhelming use of small UAVs, particularly in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. To build off of what Lieutenant General Deptula has kind of already talked about, there are categorizations of these small UAVs that the Department of Defense has defined in the Counter Small Unmanned Aircraft Systems strategy that has been primarily tasked to the Army to kind of lead up and run. But those categorizations are important. You have groups 1 through 5, and group 1 through 3 are the majority of what we've been talking about up to this point. Those unmanned aircraft systems are operating typically about 18,000 feet MSL and below. And then you have group 4 and 5 that can operate around that 18,000 foot threshold that go above 18,000 feet. And so when you start thinking about ways in which our airspace management practices can be adapted to handle these, you can quickly start thinking about the time that you and Lieutenant General Deptula were flying any sort of DCA mission where there was some sort of ADA, i.e. a Patriot, that was involved in that scenario. We use deconfliction measures to prioritize weapon resource management and allocate ADA shots compared to shots from fighter aircraft to handle and defend a portion of the airspace. It is my belief that we could adapt our current airspace management procedures and do the same thing for the small unmanned aircraft systems using a multitude of different ways. You could do that based on altitude, as we've seen be the kind of foot in the sand for the definition of the supposed air littoral, which is defined as the airspace below the coordinating altitude. So kind of a redundant discussion there, but you can do that via a coordinating level as well. So there's multiple different airspace management tools that you could adapt to account for this problem and really put forward a theory of targeting that could help deconflict between the air and ground component, ways in which to target and handle these munitions. And like the general said, we're never going to get to a PK of 1 for these things. This is warfare. And so what we can do, though, is put our best foot forward to account with our current resources and try to mitigate to the best of our abilities. And we've seen some technology that's coming forward that can help with this in the future. And we can get into that discussion here a little bit later.
Yeah, what you say makes total sense, right? Why would we abandon time-proven and established doctrine and operational techniques, tactics, procedures to address certain threats across the entire span of the airspace, right? I mean, because that coordination, deconfliction, like you've said, is crucial to making sure that we're trying to clean the airspace and not let any leakers through.
PenFed checking and savings accounts are here for all your adventures. From...
Do you take this man to be your husband?
I do.
To...
He has your eyes.
He's perfect.
Learn more at penfed.org. Federally insured by NCUA.
So we've talked a lot about the what, the operational trends that we're seeing, but let's now talk about the why. Why does air superiority matter, both in a traditional sense and in terms of this new small drone world in which we're living? And this is complex. There's air superiority for defensive purposes and offensive missions. And I'd like for us to explore all of this. John Deptula, let's start with you, and then we'll move over to SWAT.
Yeah, well, to cut right to the chase here, without air superiority, the fundamental elements of warfare become problematic. For example, strike aircraft cannot penetrate enemy defenses to conduct strategic attack, traditional interdiction, or the array of other combat air missions appropriate to a specific contingency. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, mobility, and tanker aircraft can't effectively conduct their missions. Maritime forces become vulnerable to enemy attack. Friendly forces on the ground and bases become vulnerable to enemy attack. And maneuver becomes restricted, and logistics become vulnerable. So these are not just theoretical, but they're operational realities. Russia's initial failure to suppress Ukrainian air defenses and achieve air superiority stalled its invasion. Matter of fact, it caused them to retreat, fall back, and basically give up their assault on Kyiv. Ukraine, lacking modern aircraft, turned to person-portable PGMs in the form of small UAVs and cheap cruise missiles out of necessity, not preference. So neither side gained control of the air. And the result, stalemate. By contrast, every U.S. operation in the last 4 decades, whether in contested or because they were operating in a permissive environment, benefited from air superiority to allow freedom to attack and freedom from attack. Now, there are people out there that are saying, well, you're saying that you have to have air superiority to succeed in war. Well, you got to define, the particular contingency that you're operating in. All right. What happened in Afghanistan, for example, was a failure to recognize that we'd achieved our critical U.S. national security interest by the end of December 2001. We'd removed the Taliban from power. A government friendly to the United States and our allies was in place. And we'd removed the al-Qaeda terrorist training camps from Afghanistan. But the commander of Central Command, Tommy Franks, hadn't realized that we'd already achieved our objectives. And under this doctrinal notion that ground forces were the only decisive means of fighting, he hadn't even figured the deployment planning of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and getting them into Afghanistan by the time we'd already achieved our objectives. So when they got there, they looked around and said, well, now what do we do? And we embarked on 20 years of trying to change a collection of 16th century tribes into a modern Jeffersonian democracy. That's unobtainium, regardless of whether you have air superiority or not. Yeah. So these other elements need to be put into the equation in the context of the conduct of war and what its ultimate purposes are, which are political. So a couple of points there on the fundamental elements of why air superiority is important, with a little bit of narrative on the importance of the strategic objectives and defining them before you go into a conflict. And recognizing when you've accomplished those objectives. It's absolutely incredible what happened. That was the greatest example of mission creep in history.
Well, we achieved victory because we achieved our objectives, but then fundamentally projected liability and vulnerability through putting army forces on the ground within Afghanistan. Air superiority matters, as you mentioned, for freedom to attack and freedom from attack. So it allows us to be able to control, maintain the initiative, decrease the level of defensive operations that our forces have to be able to do, while enabling them to be able to do offensive forces. And when you look historically, anytime we've been reduced to operations of close air support or interdiction, we have lost those wars. When we are able to do strategic attack, collapse the adversaries' means and methods of executing warfare, that's when we win. And that's what air superiority fundamentally provides. Swat, I want to bring you back into the conversation and hear your perspective on all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. There's a lot of discussion that these small unmanned aerial vehicles revolutionize air power concepts in warfare. And we've heard, I think, spot on commentary from Lieutenant General Deptula so thus far as to why that's not the case. We're also hearing discussions that these small UAVs are basically shifting the importance of air control from the blue skies terminology that you'll hear used down into lower airspace regimes, which is altering the doctrine of air superiority. You've also heard that because of these small UAVs, that the Air Force and manned aircraft are being displaced as relevant, and that the United States needs to rethink their approach to air superiority. And I'm here to say that I think that those are a little off base and very much alarmist reactions. That the truth is that my generation of Air Force members, and really for the last 30 years, are suffering from what I would call an air power amnesia. We haven't had to plan a conflict where there has been an air-to-air expectation in the entire time that I've been in the military, outside of exercises that we go to that you all are familiar with, whether that be at the weapons school or red flags. Those are the only places where we're actually practicing these concepts. And so it's very easy to see that the experience being brought back and proliferated throughout our operational and academic institutions is one founded in a coin fight in the Middle East, where air superiority has, and really air supremacy has been a planning assumption. And we cannot let those continue to drive the way in which the Air Force is moving in the future.
If I can just interject for a minute, part of what really concerns me is that this knowledge of how to control the air really resides within our battle managers and with our combat air pilots, specifically our fighter pilots. And as we're shrinking the force and divesting those aircraft, we're losing not just the individuals, the seasoned talent and experienced individuals who have done this job, but that they understand the importance of this doctrine and how to execute and why it's important. So the strategic amnesia isn't just simply because of the last 30 years, but as we are bringing the force structure down in battle management and in the fighter forces, we're losing the people that know why this matters.
I was just going to jump in here in the context that it's not just amnesia, it is realizing itself in the fact that we don't have any of these people teaching at Air University today, which is a fundamental problem. And we'll get to that a little bit later on.
And I'd say this isn't just Air University. It's probably the academies, ROTC, across all of our professional military education, from how we indoctrinate young airmen to how we continue to cultivate them. Why we have an Air Force should be fundamental, and our history and our application should be fundamental to that education. And I think we're falling short there.
Well, I think one other thing to talk about here also is the idea of air denial being the revolutionary concept that's going to solve all of our problems in the future. And I think it's interesting that the main case study that's being referenced for this is the Russian-Ukraine war, where void of context that the Western nations prevented the Ukrainians from using some of the kit that they were provided to strike the Russian mainland, which then allowed sanctuary for the Russians to launch unmanned aerial systems and cruise missile type attacks onto the Ukrainian homeland. You translate this forward to the Pacific, and the idea is that we should be just sitting back and creating our own A2AD bubble to counter the Chinese strategy. When in fact, as already outlined by Lieutenant General Deptula, if you achieve air superiority, there is no better option to provide flexibility while denying the enemy that airspace concurrently.
I think you said it so well, Swat. I mean, we handcuffed the Ukrainians not only because we didn't give them fighters to be able to establish air superiority, we also didn't give them the training they needed to employ those aircraft in the way that they would need to. Because remember, they have Soviet doctrine, Soviet training. They use their fighters like basically our airborne artillery. So we didn't teach them and then equip them in the way that they needed to be able to execute air superiority in a Western way. And then we handcuffed them, basically providing the Russian sanctuary. So General Deptula, as an air commander, what sort of approach would a winning strategy for the U.S. and our allies look like? I mean, not to lead you, but the Battle of Britain did not win World War II. It was a key turning point, but the RAF and the Allies had to go on the offensive to secure victory, deny sanctuary, to collapse Germany's ability to wage war.
Yeah, well, Heather, you're exactly correct. Offense wins wars. The notion that denial strategies are sufficient, relying on air defenses, dispersion, or resilience, or whatever, surrenders the initiative. A purely reactive posture would turn our friendly coalition military forces into target sets. The objective must be dominance, not endurance. And dominance in the air domain will require penetrating fifth and sixth generation fighters, penetrating stealth bombers for repeatable strategic attack, standoff long-range high payload bombers with long-range weapons, collaborative combat aircraft to enhance mass and adaptability, and a whole spectrum of additional capabilities that we're not even aware of yet, electronic warfare and cyber tools for both offense and defensive purposes, mobile integrated air and missile defenses to enable security of bases and forces, to include countering those swarms of drones, which we've seen already capabilities being demonstrated, UAVs at scale to contribute both to offense and defense, where their capabilities yield advantage, and layered and resilient air battle management capability to integrate all of what I just mentioned into a set of coherent capabilities. Adopting air denial as an approach for the U.S. military is simply not logical, desirable, or proven to be of any relevance unless you like trench warfare. It relinquishes demonstrated war-winning strategies based on counter-air approaches and strategic attack that can destroy enemy air defenses, power projection capabilities, and armies before they can be employed. Why would any U.S. military personnel want to forego those advantages?
Sir, I totally agree with you. I mean, foregoing those advantages really does not make sense because air denial is fundamentally defensive. It does not project power away from our shores, project power away from our centers of gravity, project power away from our forces. And anytime we do that, we are asking to lose the war. Again, one of the main observations we're seeing is that people are watching what's happening in Ukraine and the Red Sea, and they're extrapolating and thinking that this is the way of the future. They're failing to see that this approach is yielding a brutal war of attrition and atrocity that's wrecking and destroying both sides. So at Mitchell, we're fond of saying this looks like World War I trench warfare, and it's a disastrous set of circumstances for everyone. So what's wrong here? Why are people failing to see that these fights are driven by nuanced circumstances that don't mirror our capabilities, our position, the way that we fight war, and really is not how we want to engage? What are your thoughts?
Well, first, to be frank, and I mentioned a little bit about this earlier, Air Force professional military education must do a much more comprehensive and thorough job in teaching air power fundamentals. There's a distorted notion out there that's evolved over the past decade or so that puts more focus on joint organizations than on understanding individual service core roles and missions. In fact, there can be no joint warfare without each of the armed services personnel understanding and articulating the virtues and values of their particular service component and what it provides. That's because effective jointness requires the separate competencies of each of the services to be integrated in a fashion that best meets the needs of a particular contingency. And every contingency is going to be different. So if one does not have a solid understanding of what's worked and what has not worked in their respective domains, there can be no effective joint warfare. Furthermore, jointness requires using the right force at the right place at the right time. It's not about using every force, every place, all the time. So this notion of all domain warfare actually runs counter to true joint warfare and was inserted into joint doctrine by strong Army leadership steeped in their perception of warfare, and the Air Force let it happen without even thinking through what was going on. It is perplexing that some Air Force officers do not understand the continuing relevance of the fundamental tenets of air power necessary to exploit the advantages of operating in the third dimension. Those being control of the air, precision global attack, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, global air mobility, and command and control to optimize each of these missions. We are in fact seeing some folks in the Air Force undermine or attempt to undermine a core service mission and try to reinvent the wheel with such baseless notions of an air littoral and more focus on denial and dominance. We just talked about that. Part of the challenge is that no active duty military personnel have participated in major regional conflict. All they've experienced are the small scale coin-focused contingencies of Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, dealing with the Houthis, and quite frankly, as you mentioned earlier, both Iraq and Afghanistan at a strategic level were abject failures. Additionally, there's a bizarre proposition that you mentioned, Heather, that the Russia-Ukraine war should be a model for future warfare that the U.S. should adopt. Look, neither Russia or Ukraine possess the capabilities, capacity, or training of the U.S. military. So to draw erroneous lessons based on warfighting conditions categorically different from U.S. capabilities, to put it mildly, is ill-advised. If this kind of thinking becomes prevalent, I really do fear that we're going to have our nose badly bloodied, if not lose altogether, in some untoward conflict somewhere in the world before we wise up to the fact that the abiding principles and needs of effective air warfare remain as valid today as they were before.
And some of the arguments that we're seeing put out into the idea space are that, well, when you look at the Pacific problem, the U.S. cannot, risk striking mainland China to try to frustrate their ability to sortie air power, because that might cross some type of red line or cause further escalation. When I believe that in reality, based on the nature of the Pacific, the places which we're going to operate are not hidden. We have satellites, and so do the Chinese, and those airfields are well known. And so if we think that the Chinese are going to allow us to just operate freely from those air bases, I think are avoiding some of the nuance that we're seeing from the Russian-Ukraine war, where airfields are being targeted. And so we've seen that in the past in all major conflicts. We look to prevent the ability for air forces to be able to get off the ground and into the air. And I don't see a scenario where the Chinese and the United States both say, you know what, you can have your free sanctuary and start lobbing munitions into this fight without targeting those places. And so that is where a lot of this air denial piece is coming from. Well, we clearly will not strike the mainland, therefore we can just do a denial strategy, when in reality we're just providing the same sanctuary that the Russians have been afforded based on their technological capabilities overmatched to what the Ukrainians are. And we know that they're catching up now from some Western help. And so we have to be very careful on how we look at this moving forward.
I mean, there's a huge part of this that is deterrence, which, as we all know, is a heck of a lot more prudent and responsible in going to war in the first place. So deterrence is all about inducing uncertainty in the mind of your adversary and telling them in advance that, hey, you can do whatever you want. Don't worry, we're not going to attack your homeland. It's insanity. And it is counterproductive to achieving a deterrent status. No, the Chinese need to think twice about, if they assault Taiwan, that Shanghai might be gone. Not through the use of nuclear weapons, but through the use of conventional weapons. Those are the kinds of positions that we need to be taking, not yielding sanctuary to our adversaries. And then worse of all worses is telling them that in the first place.
Well, and providing
every principle of warfare.
Yeah, violates every principle of warfare, absolutely. And by providing China sanctuary, we are empowering them to attack our forces, which is an immoral position from my perspective, because we're giving them the opportunity to be able to use their rocket forces, to use their air power to attack us. And why would we deliberately put our airmen, soldiers, sailors, Marines in that kind of harm on purpose? That makes absolutely no sense. But to get to what Swat was saying earlier about China attacking our bases, I think people need to understand we will still be able to generate combat sorties even under attack and through attack. When we've looked at what's been going on with Israel and how Israel has been bombarded by Iranian cruise missiles, long-range drones, ballistic missiles, and even when you take a look at Ukraine, who's been attacked by hypersonics and so forth, both of those air forces have been able to continue to generate combat air power even under attack. And so this notion that we're not going to be able to do that, as well as providing sanctuary, just makes no sense. Grant, I'm really curious because a lot of your cohort, your colleagues, your peers within the Air Force, they're biting off on this. Why do you think they're so attracted to this air denial?
Yeah, I think a lot of it goes back to a lack of understanding and a lack of operational experience of being able to employ in an air-to-air combat. Just hasn't existed. And I think that, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that I wish we've had a conflict in the past where we would have gone and done air-to-air conflict. I mean, clearly we don't want to be out in a deployed environment doing those things. But it is true that because we haven't had a type of conflict where air-to-air planning had to occur. I mean, the last time that occurred was when the boss did that, back before Operation Desert Storm. And so it is just a reality that the experience is not there. And so we glean on that experience. During COIN, there was this air supremacy that existed that allowed for the freely movement of our air forces to go and strike targets. Most of the threats were from a man-portable air defense variety that we could easily overfly as a United States Air Force. The other factor to that coin environment that is, I think, percolating its way through the current ideas that are being broadcast is this notion that you have inherent air battle management that's going to help provide coordination for these forces. I mean, CENTCOM has one of the most sophisticated and unique air battle management setups from this fact that you have radars situated all throughout that combatant command from the conflicts that we've been in. And so the boss already brought up the situation with the Israeli attack, but some of that air domain awareness, no doubt, was provided from that U.S. infrastructure that exists there, and that doesn't exist in the Pacific. And so the notion that we'll be able to just sit back and conduct an air denial focused approach, lacking air domain awareness as we've started to divest that air battle management capability, is not a recipe for success.
I'll also say this. Academics are rewarded for being iconoclasts. They need to contribute something new to the body of knowledge. And so they don't get rewarded professionally by emphasizing what have been established and enduring principles of air power. Here's my concern. Even though they're pursuing some new kind of contribution to air power in their perspective, lives will be at stake. If we don't get this right, people can die.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In fact, Admiral Paparo, the Indo-Pacific Command commander, was recently asked about the employment and growing advent of these small uncrewed devices and how they're wreaking havoc in the Russian-Ukraine war. And he kind of laughed it off and said, oh, well, yeah, okay, got it. We have some drones. So what? We should stop pursuing air and surface superiority. The Chinese have 2,100 aircraft. They have 3 carriers and counting. I mean, they are pursuing the force and technology that we had basically there at Desert Storm, and they're doing so at a much faster pace than we are. And so I thought his comments captured eloquently the notion that, yeah, we have to account for the small unmanned aerial system threat, but that is not going to solve our ability to achieve the domain superiority needed to counter and go on the offensive should a conflict arise with the PRC or anyone else for that matter across the world.
And I think another piece that is not well understood is that people look at these drones that are being used in Ukraine and Russia, and they don't realize that these smaller drones don't have the reach, the altitude, the range to be effective in the Pacific theater. But that is something that can certainly be developed. So we can't ignore these smaller drones or even mid-sized drones. They can be dangerous, but they also present some major opportunities that we might want to exploit on our side. So General Deptula, what are your thoughts on how we could pursue that in a smart, additive fashion?
Yeah, Heather, it's a great question. From a defensive perspective, they do pose some significant challenges, even in the Pacific, because we have to be careful here in the context of dealing with the possibility, yes, range is an issue, but they can be inserted into locations, for example, at operating locations and bases in ways using other means, covert, that need to be dealt with. So defensive is one piece. On the offensive side of the equation, there's some pretty fascinating and interesting possibilities here too. But I hesitate to go into too much detail because all we do by doing that is provide our adversaries some insights into what we're thinking about. So I just won't say a whole lot about the offensive potential, but they certainly hold that as well.
So what we'll need to do is be able to integrate everything from the small hobbyist type drones up to collaborative combat aircraft with manned platforms, manned aircraft. So Grant, how do we need to think about the air battle space to effectively execute both of these missions? And you referred earlier about how to do that kind of air control from the small drone work plus the traditional offensive and defensive air power. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned previously, there is an ability to adapt our airspace management practices to account for the small unmanned aerial system threat in the way I've proposed. And again, there's other ways to approach it, but an example to deviate from would be the definition used by those perpetuating the air littoral is the airspace below the coordinating altitude is what is going to be oversaturated. Well, we know that from Key West agreement that, the Army has been particularly charged with conducting point defense and then as well as providing cover for maneuvering ground forces. And look, I'm not here to say that we must abide specifically by what's happened in 1947. There are some nuances that have changed, but writ large, part of the problem that we're seeing with the ability of the ground forces to counter some of these unmanned aerial systems is the fact that during COIN, the Army divested its striker and shore-ed capability in favor of point defense based on the nature of the conflict in assets such as Patriot. And so we're seeing the Army reverse course on that, which is a good thing. We're seeing the reintroduction of shore-ed battalions, not only kinetic, but also directed energy shore-ed vehicles are being developed and deployed. We're seeing also the employment of Coyote vehicle-based air defense systems that are targeted towards UAS that also have a fixed component as well that are in the form of shipping containers that you can put at these air bases to provide a layer of defense. We're seeing what the Israelis have introduced and called the Iron Beam at $2.50 to $3 per shot to be able to provide a contribution in that layer defense approach. We're also seeing AFRL, the Air Force Research Laboratory, has introduced a microwave device that you can plug into a wall outlet that can use microwaves to try to affect the circuitry of these small unmanned aerial systems. Finally, we're seeing some other kinetic options coming from the PRC, which are interesting and a monstrosity to look at, but they call it the Iron Bullet, but essentially sends out a mass of bullets that's explode into other submunitions that can then basically provide a cluster effect in an airspace to prevent or to counter drone swarms has been postulated as well. And so when you start looking at some of these effects and the ability to then say, okay, well, based on our traditional Air Force capability, perhaps the air component should be responsible for these uncrewed systems that are flying above the coordinating altitude, whatever that may be established at based on the AOR, essentially greater than 18,000 feet, because that's where traditionally we'd like to see the manned aircraft to look to counter. And we can then pass off targeting responsibility to the ground component for anything that's below that. Again, we're primarily talking about group 1 through 3 UAS that are moving a lot slower than the group 4 and 5s do. But that also allows for, under our traditional codified doctrine of an area air defense commander, which is typically dual-hatted as the JFAC or the CFAC, to then integrate and use deconfliction purposes to provide for targeting by exception. So it doesn't mean that the air doesn't have to have knowledge of what's going on below the coordinating altitude in my example, or that the Army doesn't have to have, or the ground component doesn't have to have knowledge of what's going on above, but you can actually have coordination that can then deconflict fires and allow for the best resource at the best time based on the threat.
And I think that it's important to understand that this coordinating altitude and the responsibility between the two forces, obviously we're talking about the vertical component, but from the horizontal component, there's a point past which we probably aren't seeing the Army do a whole heck of a lot because they've got a forward edge of the battle area. And for a strategic strike, that's going to be entirely owned by the air commander.
Correct.
So what does this mean from a roles and missions perspective? General Deptula, you've got a lot of experience in those debates.
Well, let me give you a very specific example, Heather, and try not to drag this out too long, but it's important because this just happened recently. On 30 April of this year, the Secretary of Defense sent out an Army transformation memo that uses a term that is not in the DoD dictionary and has not been vetted through the Joint Doctrine Development process. And the manner that it's used in the memo may be detrimental to not just future Air Force component operations, but joint operations overall. Specifically in the memo, what it states is that the Secretary of the Army is directed to achieve electromagnetic and air littoral dominance by 2027. So we're back to this term air littoral. It's a conceptual novelty being advocated by a couple of Air Force colonels and academics. And of course, the Army's picked up on it because it plays to their advantage. Yeah. These colonels have been pushing it in defense-related publications since the start of the Russian-Ukraine war. We talked about this earlier. It's related to the increased use of small UAVs in the vicinity of ground forces who are locked in stalemate. Now, look, there are several concerns with its use. First, the term's a non sequitur. By definition, littoral is related to the shore of the sea or a lake or the ocean. And there are no seas or lakes in the sky the last time I checked. Second, this fabricated term is defined by its advocates as the area from the coordinating altitude to the Earth's surface. SWAT just talked a little bit about this. Coordinating altitude is a procedural airspace control method that's already ensconced in joint doctrine and is used to separate fixed and rotary wing aircraft. Introducing new terminology without necessity or thorough vetting in the joint doctrine development process confuses what's already clear. More importantly, the way the SecDef directs the Army Secretary to achieve air littoral dominance implies that airspace, defined as the air littoral, is now going to be under the control of the Army. And from a joint perspective, this is problematic for a variety of reasons. Remember when I told you, jointness is not used in every force, every place, all the time. It's used in the right force at the right place at the right time. So there are going to be places and times and elements where you're not going to have Army forces engaged. All right? Third, drawing a comparison to contested maritime zones, the proponents of this term, air littoral, go on to argue that it's the airspace between ground forces and high-end fighters and bombers. Well, this is a ludicrous definition, considering that high-end fighters routinely operate at low altitudes. And as we mentioned, they just recently demonstrated very effectively doing that in defeating the Iranian cruise missile attacks against Israel last year. So, relabeling existing airspace constructs introduces ambiguity, not clarity. The joint operational need among all the service components is not to introduce new terms for ones that already exist or provide de facto control of a segment of airspace to one service, but to ensure that integrated control measures for both ground-based air defenses are adopted with air forces from all the service components to effectively deal with the large number of enemy cruise missiles, person-portable PGMs or drones, if you insist on using that ignorant term, at scale, and or swarms of drones. So that's just a little bit of insight into the kinds of roles and missions issues that this whole subject brings up.
Thank you, sir. So, SWAT, put your squadron commander hat on, and let's take this roles and missions conversation and make it more concrete for our airmen. What do we need to do to ensure that our airmen are equipped to succeed in both of these realms, like the small drone world and traditional forms of air power? And how does that integrate with the roles and missions that General Deptula just spoke about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, understanding the problem is first and foremost, and we've talked at length about ways in which I believe our force is not informed about what these weapon systems, one, how they act and how they can be treated. And so at the squadron level, I think that an education is important. And we see that when we go and perform exercises, we are typically doing some type of preparation prior to going in and executing those exercises. But I think a way in which that we can help at the squadron level get understanding and develop tactics, techniques, and procedures to counter these is to incorporate in our exercises some air defense integration under our integrated air defense construct for ways in which to deconflict shots. Just like I talked about earlier, where we talked about the use of Patriot and fighter aircraft in a DCA scenario, there's an ability to incorporate some of this new technology that we're wanting to use on the battlefield to counter uncrewed aerial systems and bring those into those exercises as we get them online that can then provide that layer of coordination for not only our command and control air battle management professionals, but also bring into the fold for our lane commanders and fighter pilots that are executing in 4-ship or 8-ship formations to have a use of that coordination and really start learning about the weapons resource management discussion. Hey, do I want to use an AIM-9 or an AIM-120 at a cost per effect discussion, or do I want to pass that off to a ground component to then target?
Thanks for that, SWAT. As we end this conversation, I'd like to end on one question, which actually has two parts. Where should we be in 5 years, and what does good look like? So what does winning comms, what's a winning picture for us, as well as what are the major pitfalls we should avoid, and what's the cost of these bad decisions? And what would the potential cost of those decisions be if we don't avoid them? Right. So I'll give you my first 2 cents. I think we do need to have small drone defenses, but they need to be sustainable from a cost per effect advantage. And so SWAT, that's why I'm glad you mentioned making a decision on that cost per effect, because we need to harness the opportunities that small drones afford. But there are huge roles and missions questions. But we need to make sure that we maintain our traditional modern air superiority capabilities and capacity, both from the maneuver element of that, right? Fighters, missiles, as well as the battle management element of that, because we know that you have to have both to be effective. So what are your thoughts on this? Sir, we'll start with you, and SWAT will end with you.
Well, Heather, first, in the interest of time, I kind of like your answer that you provided in your question. So I would just emphasize that Look, innovation is essential, but discarding what works is not. Tactical advances, to include the use of small UAVs, should be integrated with doctrine, not used to invalidate it prematurely. The absence of air superiority in Ukraine shows us what happens when that capability is missing. Air superiority is an enabler of success in major combat operations. It's not obsolete, it's essential, and it must remain a central tenet of U.S. air power.
Thank you, sir. SWAT?
Yeah, thanks. I would say that a truth is the airspace below the coordinating altitude has always been contested, whether that be from AAA, man-portable air defenses, or mobile surface-to-air missile systems. All of those create significant tactical problems for fighter aircraft and for the force to have to figure out how to operate. Additionally, the definition of air superiority has not changed due to the recent use of small UAS in Ukraine and the Middle East, or their use as cruise missiles for long-range lethal attacks. I'd say, on the contrary, that small UAVs have been employed because, in the case of Russia, they have not attained air superiority due to that poor leadership and lack of training that Lieutenant General Deptula brought up. And in the case of Ukraine, they just don't have the capacity, and we're seeing them pursue that capacity by coordination with their Western supporters. To stay ahead, combatant commanders must integrate counter-UAV tech like MSHORAD, lasers, jammers, some of those other capabilities that we talked about into wargaming against peer threats, ensuring the viability of air superiority as it remains the linchpin of future victories. Avoiding this amnesia ensures resources bolster, not bypass, the framework that already exists and is codified, that is proven to work. The lack of a recent air-to-air combat experience against medium to high-altitude threats shaped by 20 years of counterinsurgency operations in Iraq and Afghanistan must not distract our military from prioritizing air superiority, which does not include quadcopters with hand grenades. Pursuing air superiority in challenging threat environments must drive strategic thinking, planning, and budget requests, or the U.S. risks ceding the air domain advantage to our adversaries. The U.S. Air Force must sustain investment in advanced crewed and uncrewed aircraft, such as the F-47 Next Generation Air Dominance, penetrating counter-air aircraft, the F-22, F-35, and the Collaborative Combat Aircraft, and air battle management platforms like the E-7, and recapitalization of ground capabilities such as the Control and Reporting Center to counter sophisticated adversaries and maintain the air superiority vital to achieving national objectives.
Far from signaling an existential crisis, small UAVs underscore a dual truth. Air superiority remains paramount, and coordinated Army-Air Force efforts rooted in proven doctrine are required to secure victory in future conflicts.
I think that's a mic drop moment. Thank you, gentlemen, both for being here, and fascinating conversation. Look forward to chatting with y'all again.
Thanks, Heather. Have a great day.
Thanks, Heather. Really appreciated it.
And with that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's conversation. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to you, our listeners, for your continued support and for tuning into today's show. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to hit that like button or follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas that you would like us to explore further. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on X, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great aerospace power kind of day. See you next time. CCA then have to have the maneuverability and performance and range of the actual aircraft and targets. They have to look, taste, smell, emit, sound like actual targets to be, or they have to be a valid threat that the adversary has to honor. And those are actually expensive things to do.
That's right. And oh no, by the way, if we just making a missile soaks, then we don't get to reuse them, which is the whole point.
Well, yeah, it's not actually the whole point. I mean, if you're going to deliberately use them as missile soaks, that is a valid use for a subset of the CCA. Not all of them, but a subset of the CCA. But again,
yeah,
I mean,
better said. Better said. That's what I meant. There is a subset that we want to come back, right?
Yeah.
We want to reuse them. So.
And actually, I would argue a larger subset because you can do more things with them. Mm-hmm. Right. Hey, sir, one thing I was thinking about when SWAT was telling me that you guys basically presented to a handful of instructors.
Yeah.
I know, SWAT, you're heading off, but could we have you, JV, and SWAT reprise your presentation on an Aerospace Nation?
Yeah. I'm always available to you guys whenever you need me. So.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. That would be a good thing to do.
And then we can share it and spread that out and
Right.
and try to make that go viral.
Right.
Because I think, and by the way, thank you for sharing your slides and your script. Those came down over a cloud. I'm not sure if that was your intention of to send files or cloud access, but regardless, I downloaded them. And I think, again, this is something that we absolutely should do as an aerospace nation, and maybe even expound a little bit on that to include additional critique of the air littoral, air denial things.
Yeah. The reason it came down in a cloud is because it's a 58 megabyte file.
Oh, got it. Okay. That would be, that makes sense.